Welcome, dear readers, to a story that is not just about rebuilding a house, but about rebuilding lives, strengthening relationships, and rediscovering the meaning of kindness. Imagine a chance encounter on a quiet rural road, a flat tire, and a boy with a selfless heart. From that small yet meaningful act, a journey of transformation unfolds, challenging everything we think we know about wealth, purpose, and the power of human connection. Step into this heartfelt tale, ready to be inspired, moved, and to reflect on the small moments that create the greatest changes in life. Don't forget to hit subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next heartwarming and meaningful stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding rural road as David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, frustration bubbling beneath his polished exterior. He cursed under his breath, stepping out of his sleek black luxury sedan to inspect the unmistakable cause of his sudden stop, a flat tire. The air around him was still, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. David, a man accustomed to boardrooms and chauffeur-driven cars, stared at the deflated tire like it was an alien artifact. He tugged at his tailored jacket, irritated by the dust that clung to his Italian leather loafers, and muttered, "Of all places." As he scrolled through his phone in search of roadside assistance, a voice startled him. "Hey, mister, got trouble with your car?" David turned abruptly, his annoyance simmering as he faced the speaker, a boy no older than 14, with tousled sandy hair and a cheeky grin. The boy's clothes were simple, patched in places, and his sneakers were scuffed from wear. "Yeah," David replied, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. "Flat tire. I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy tilted his head, inspecting the car with a confidence that seemed incongruous with his age. "I can do it. My dad showed me how. The spare's usually under the back. Mind if I take a look?" David hesitated, the boy's offer catching him off guard. "You're really doing this?" he asked, incredulous. The boy, who introduced himself as Lucas, shrugged and got to work. David stood by, arms crossed, his skepticism slowly morphing into astonishment as Lucas deftly loosened the bolts, swapped the tire, and tightened everything with a precision that would have impressed a professional mechanic. "You're sure about this?" David asked, watching as Lucas wiped his hands on his jeans. "Yup," Lucas said, stepping back to admire his work. "Good as new." David reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, for your trouble." Lucas's face tightened, his smile fading into a resolute expression. "Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help." David blinked, confused. Why not? Everyone wants something. "Not me," Lucas replied with a shrug. "Sometimes it just feels good to do the right thing." "Have a good day, mister." And just like that, the boy turned and walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the golden haze of the setting sun. The ride home was silent save for the hum of the engine. David's thoughts churned, the encounter replaying in his mind. When he finally arrived at his sprawling estate, his wife Clara greeted him with her usual grace, but the tension in his face didn't go unnoticed. "Rough day?" she asked, setting a glass of wine on the kitchen counter. David sank into a chair, loosening his tie. "You could say that." Clara leaned against the counter, waiting for him to continue. "A kid helped me with the tire today," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. 14, maybe younger, fixed it in minutes." "That's impressive," Clara replied with a small smile. "Did you pay him?" "Wouldn't take the money," David said, his tone a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "He just walked away. Said he wanted to help." Clara's smile widened. "That's kind of amazing. People aren't usually that nice for nothing these days." David leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Exactly. Everyone wants something, Clara. A favor, A return on investment? Something. But this kid, he didn't. Maybe he's one of the rare ones, Clara suggested. Sometimes people do good things just because they can. David scoffed, but the faintest flicker of something, was it doubt, crossed his face. At dinner that evening, the boy's image lingered in his thoughts. He tried to push it aside, but it clung to him like a shadow. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted to Clara, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Why would someone do that? He could have taken the money." "Maybe he didn't need it," Clara said simply. "Or maybe he's just different." David frowned, her words sparking a new unease within him. "Different, huh? The world doesn't work like that." "Maybe it should," she replied, her voice soft but firm. By the next morning, David's curiosity had morphed into something stronger, a compulsion he couldn't ignore. He found himself back on the same stretch of road, scanning the surroundings for any sign of Lucas. After an hour of searching, he spotted a small house tucked away behind a row of trees. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagging in places, and a rusty bicycle leaned against the porch railing. David hesitated before stepping out of his car. The polished millionaire in him balked at the idea of approaching such a place, but something deeper urged him forward. He knocked on the weathered door, and after a moment, a woman answered. She was in her mid-30s, her tired eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "I'm looking for Lucas," David said, feeling oddly out of place. "He helped me with my car yesterday, and I wanted to thank him properly." The woman's expression softened. "Lucas," she called, and moments later the boy appeared, his grin as cheeky as before. "No, hey, mister," Lucas said, clearly surprised. "You came back." David nodded, awkwardly running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me. I want to do something for you in return." Lucas waved him off, laughing. "I told you it was no big deal, just wanted to help." David looked at the boy's mother, noting the pride in her eyes despite the humble surroundings. "There must be something," he insisted. "Anything you need." "We don't need anything fancy, Mr. David," the woman said, her tone kind but firm. "We've managed fine, but thank you." Lucas chimed in, "Really, mister, we're good." David left the house that day with more questions than answers. For the first time in years, he felt unmoored. The boy's selflessness, his family's quiet dignity, it gnawed at something deep within him, something he hadn't confronted in years. As he drove away, David glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of Lucas and his mother on the porch. His chest tightened. This was just the beginning. The engine's soft purr filled the cabin as David drove home, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Yet the calm, rhythmic hum of the car offered no solace. His thoughts swirled like a storm threatening to break loose. The encounter with Lucas was a thorn lodged in his mind, not painful, but persistently irritating, demanding attention. David replayed the scene, as vivid as if it were happening again. The boy's confident hands on the tire, his nonchalant refusal of the money, and that parting line, "Just wanted to help." It was a sentence so simple yet so alien that it echoed endlessly in David's head. As the estate came into view, with its grand wrought iron gate swinging open to greet him, David felt an uncharacteristic pang of dissatisfaction. The sprawling mansion, the perfectly manicured gardens, the shimmering pool, it all seemed, at least for a moment, hollow. He stepped out of the car and into the cavernous silence of his home. Clara was in the living room, reading by the fire, her face bathed in its warm glow. "You're back early," she said, glancing up. "Find the boy?" "I did," David replied, loosening his tie and collapsing into the armchair opposite her. His voice was unusually subdued, lacking his typical edge. Clara set her book down, sensing his unease. "Oh, what's on your mind?" she prompted gently. Baby leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and stared into the flickering flames as if they went back to thank him. "Lucas, he and his mother live in a house that's barely standing, roof's fallen apart, pipes probably shot to hell. I offered to do something for them, anything, but they turned me down, said they didn't need help." Clara tilted her head, her expression softening. "And that bothers you?" "Yes," David admitted, the words slipping out before he could filter it. He sat back, rubbing his temples. "I can't stop thinking about it. This kid had nothing, and he helped me. He wouldn't take money. He wouldn't even let me repay him. Who does that? What kind of world are they living in where they don't even ask for help when it's staring them in the face?" Clara smiled faintly, her voice calm yet piercing. "Maybe it's not the kind of world they live in, David. Maybe it's the kind of people they are." Her words struck him like a blow, their weight settling into the pit of his stomach. He didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between them. That night, sleep eluded him. As David lay in the expansive bed he shared with Clara, his mind wandered to a time long past, a time before the wealth and power, before the estate and the suits. He was a young man then, scrambling to make ends meet, his days defined by struggle and ambition. He remembered the nights spent in a cramped apartment with a leaky ceiling, the weeks when instant noodles were his only meals. And he remembered the kindnesses he had once relied on, small, unassuming gestures from strangers that had kept him going. A neighbor who had left a warm meal at his door, a teacher who had lent him money for books without ever asking for it back, a stranger who had shared a cab on a rainy day. He'd been Lucas once, hadn't he? A boy who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. But somewhere along the way, that version of himself had been buried under layers of wealth, success, and the unrelenting pursuit of more. The thought unsettled him, like a ghost rising from the depths of a forgotten past. David turned onto his side, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. When had he stopped believing in selflessness? Was it the first time a business partner betrayed him? Or the time he realized his wealth made him a target for endless demands? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. Lucas's simple act of kindness had struck a chord in him, awakening something he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, David sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight filtering through the curtains. Clara stirred beside him, her sleepy voice breaking the silence. You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," David replied. "Too much on my mind." Clara sat up, her eyes searching his face. "Still thinking about Lucas?" He nodded. "I can't shake it, Clara. It's like he's holding a mirror up to me, and I don't like what I see. All this..." He gestured to the room, to the house beyond it. "It's everything I ever wanted. But why doesn't it feel like enough?" Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Maybe it's not about what you have. Maybe it's about what you give." Her words lingered as David got dressed and made his way downstairs. The staff greeted him as usual, their polished manners a stark contrast to the rough authenticity of Lucas and his mother. David barely acknowledged them, his mind elsewhere. He stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. For the first time in years, David felt unsure of himself, his carefully constructed world shifting beneath his feet. Lucas's house, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, loomed large in his thoughts. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't dismiss it as someone else's problem. By the time David arrived at his office, his resolve had solidified into something tangible. He paced the length of his corner office, the city skyline sprawling before him. The wealth and power he had spent decades amassing now felt like tools he could wield to make a difference, to do something that mattered. He pulled out his phone and dialed Clara. She answered on the second ring. "David?" "I've made up my mind," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to help them." Clara didn't sound surprised. "I thought you might. What are you planning?" "Oh, I don't know yet," he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "But I can't just walk away, not this time." That evening, David sat in his study, pen in hand, sketching out ideas. A simple donation wouldn't be enough. He wanted to do something lasting, something transformative. He thought about the house, the roof, the plumbing, the walls that barely held together. And he thought about Lucas, the boy with the confident hands and the unshakable spirit. What if this could be a start, David wondered, a way to give back, to rediscover the part of himself that he had lost. As the hours ticked by, a plan began to take shape. It wouldn't just be about fixing the house. It would be about building something greater. Hope, security, a future. For Lucas, for his mother, and, in some small way, for himself. David sat back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not because of a deal closed or a profit made, but because of the possibility of making a difference. The decision was made. Now it was time to act. The road unfurled before David like a winding thread through a tapestry of gold and green. The countryside seemed to hum with life, a stark contrast to the polished sterility of his world. It was a place untouched by the sharp edges of skyscrapers or the calculated rhythms of corporate ambition. The air here felt different, fresher, as if inviting him to breathe deeply and let go. Yet David's grip on the steering wheel remained tight, his chest taut with an unspoken tension. He wasn't sure why he'd come back. Logic told him it was unnecessary. Lucas had said it himself. He didn't need anything. But the boy's words had settled into David's mind like a stone in still water, rippling outward in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sometimes it just feels good to do the right thing. What did that even mean? The question gnawed at him as he turned down the narrow road where he'd first met Lucas. The house came into view, nestled amidst overgrown grass and leaning trees, a picture of quiet resilience against time and circumstance. Its weathered exterior stood in stark contrast to the gleaming estate David had left behind that morning. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers lingering on the ignition key. This wasn't his world, and the thought of stepping into it felt unnervingly intimate. He exhaled, forcing himself to move. The crunch of gravel beneath his shoes echoed in the stillness as he approached the door, its paint chipped and peeling. He raised his hand to knock but paused, his hesitation uncharacteristic. The door, though old and frail, seemed to carry the weight of something sacred, a boundary he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. Finally, he knocked, 3 firm raps that sounded louder than he'd intended. The silence that followed stretched, making him acutely aware of his own heartbeat. When the door creaked open, Lucas's mother stood on the other side, her expression a mixture of curiosity and guarded politeness. "Mr. David," she said, her voice warm yet cautious. "Back again?" David cleared his throat, feeling the awkwardness of the moment settle over him like an ill-fitting coat. "Yes, I couldn't stop thinking about what your son did for me. I wanted to thank him properly." Her face softened, a smile touching her lips. "Lucas!" she called over her shoulder, stepping aside to let David in. The house was modest to the point of sparseness, but it carried an undeniable sense of warmth. Worn furniture was arranged with care, and sunlight streamed through a window adorned with homemade curtains. David's sharp eyes caught the details, the patched upholstery, the scuffed wooden floors, the faint smell of baking. It was a home. in every sense of the word, and its quiet dignity struck him deeply. Lucas bounded into the room, his grin as wide as ever. "Hey, mister, you came back!" "I did," David said, his voice softer than he'd expected. "I wanted to thank you again for helping me, and I wanted to do something for you in return." Lucas waved a dismissive hand, laughing. "I told you it was no big deal." "It was a big deal to me," David replied, the sincerity in his voice surprising even himself. "And I don't think I've ever met anyone who'd do something like that without expecting anything in return." Lucas tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "Well, my dad always said the world's tough enough without people making it harder. I just try to remember that." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. David felt a tightness in his throat, the weight of his own cynicism pressing against him. How long had it been since he'd thought that way? Since he'd believed in the goodness of people without suspicion or doubt? Over the next hour, David stayed, sitting awkwardly on the threadbare couch as Lucas's mother, whose name he learned was Evelyn, served him a cup of coffee. It was a far cry from the imported blends he drank at home, but it was warm, strong, and unexpectedly comforting. Their conversation was light at first. Small talk about the weather, Lucas's school, and the challenges of keeping the old house standing. But as they spoke, David felt himself lowering the defenses he didn't even realize he'd brought with him. "You've done a great job raising him," David said, his eyes flickering to Lucas, who was fiddling with a box of tools in the corner. Evelyn smiled, her gaze softening as she looked at her son. "He's a good kid, always has been. We've had our struggles, but we've managed." Her words carried an understated strength that David couldn't help but admire. It was clear that managing hadn't been easy, yet there was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet pride. I want to help," David said suddenly, the words spilling out before he'd fully thought them through. "Not just because of the tire, but because I can." Evelyn looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "Mr. David, that's kind of you, but we don't need charity." "It's not charity," David insisted, leaning forward. "Think of it as an investment in Lucas, in your family." Lucas, who had been quietly listening, piped up. "What kind of investment?" David turned to the boy, his lips quirking into a small smile. "One that starts with fixing this house." The days that followed were a blur of activity. David threw himself into the project with a fervor that surprised everyone, including himself. He hired contractors to repair the roof and plumbing, brought in carpenters to reinforce the walls, and even joined in the work himself, trading his tailored suits for jeans and work boots. At first, the sight of him with a hammer in hand drew amused looks from the workers. "Not used to getting your hands dirty, huh?" Lucas teased one afternoon, his grin as cheeky as ever. "Not really," David admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it feels good." Lucas nodded, his expression turning serious. "You're a good guy, mister. I don't care what you say." The words hit David harder than they should have, stirring something deep within him. He didn't feel like a good guy, not yet. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. As the renovations progressed, so did David's connection to Lucas and Evelyn. He began to see the beauty in their resilience, the quiet strength in their ability to find joy despite their struggles. And in their world, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose, of belonging. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David stood on the newly repaired porch, watching Lucas chase fireflies in the yard. Evelyn joined him, a warm cup of tea in her hands. "You've done more than fix this house, you know," she said, her voice soft. "You've given us hope." David turned to her, his expression earnest. "You and Lucas reminded me of what matters most. I'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, Evelyn smiled, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Well, don't forget again." David nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. He wouldn't. This was just the beginning. The first morning of the renovation dawned with a crispness in the air that seemed to carry the promise of change. David arrived early, his car crunching over the gravel driveway as the sun painted the sagging roof in hues of soft gold. The house, once tired and weary, stood like a sentinel weathering the passage of time. Today, it would begin its transformation, and with it, so would David. A group of contractors followed close behind, their trucks laden with tools and supplies. The hum of their engines and the clatter of equipment broke the morning stillness. David stepped out of his car, a newfound energy in his stride as he approached Evelyn and Lucas, who stood on the porch watching the arrival of their unexpected blessing. "Good morning," David said, his voice carrying an enthusiasm that felt foreign but welcome. "You ready for this?" Lucas nodded, his eyes wide with excitement. "You're really doing this, mister?" David crouched to meet the boy's gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're doing this, Lucas. You, me, and everyone here." Evelyn placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Mr. David, this is more than we could have ever dreamed of. Thank you." "You don't need to thank me," David said, standing and meeting her gaze. "You and Lucas have already done more for me than you realize." As the crew got to work, the house came alive with the symphony of construction. Hammers striking nails, saws cutting through wood, and voices calling out instructions. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that signaled progress. David found himself drawn into the fray, shedding the polished persona of a millionaire businessman for the grit and grind of manual labor. The roof was the first to be tackled. David climbed the ladder alongside the workers, his tailored hands unaccustomed to the weight of shingles but determined to contribute. As he nailed the first piece into place, he glanced down to see Lucas watching him from below, his face alight with admiration. "You're not half bad at this, mister," Lucas called, laughing. "Don't let the suit fool you," David replied, his voice tinged with humor. I might just be a natural." The boy's laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, and for a moment it felt like the world had narrowed to just this: a house being rebuilt, a boy's joy, and the faint whisper of redemption in the air. As the days turned into weeks, the house began to shed its worn skin. The roof, once a patchwork of leaks and decay, now gleamed with fresh shingles. The walls were stripped of their peeling paint, replaced with a warm, earthy tone that seemed to breathe life into the structure. Inside, the plumbing was overhauled, the creaky floorboards replaced, and the kitchen transformed into a space that invited warmth and conversation. David spent every day on site, his hands growing rougher, his muscles aching in ways he hadn't felt in years, but it wasn't just the physical work that marked a change in him. It was the connection he felt to the project, to Lucas and Evelyn, and to a version of himself he thought he'd lost. Lucas, ever curious and eager, became David's shadow. The boy asked endless questions about tools, construction, and life beyond the rural road they called home. David answered as best he could, finding a strange satisfaction in sharing pieces of himself with the boy. "You ever build something like this before?" Lucas asked one afternoon as they painted the porch railings side by side. "Not exactly," David admitted. "Most of what I've built has been on paper, business plans, contracts, deals." Lucas frowned, his brush pausing mid-stroke. "That doesn't sound as fun." David chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, you're right. This feels real, like it matters." For Evelyn, the transformation of her home was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a renewal of hope. She watched as the house took shape, her disbelief slowly giving way to joy. One evening, as David prepared to leave, she stopped him on the newly built front porch. "I don't think I've ever seen Lucas this happy," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's like the house is coming back to life, and so is he." David leaned against the porch railing, gazing out at the yard where Lucas chased fireflies. "It's not just the house," he said, almost to himself. "It's everything. You and Lucas. You've reminded me of things I'd forgotten. What it feels like to care about something beyond numbers and profits." Evelyn studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Whatever brought you to us, Mr. David, I'm glad it did." The final week of the renovation was a whirlwind of activity. David worked alongside the crew until late in the evening, determined to see every detail through. When the last nail was hammered and the last coat of paint dried, the house stood as a testament to resilience and renewal. On the final day, Evelyn and Lucas invited the neighbors over for a small celebration. The yard was strung with lights, the air filled with the aroma of home-cooked food, and the sounds of laughter and conversation echoed into the night. David, standing to the side with a glass of lemonade, found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in years. As Lucas ran up to him, clutching a plate of cookies, David knelt to the boy's level. "So, what do you think?" "It's amazing," Lucas said, his eyes sparkling. "You didn't just fix the house, mister. You made it better than it's ever been." David ruffled the boy's hair, a warmth spreading through him. "It wasn't just me, Lucas. It was all of us. And you're the reason it all started." Lucas beamed, his gratitude shining brighter than the string lights above. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Evelyn approached David, her expression one of quiet reflection. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. David shook his head, his own voice soft. "You already have. You and Lucas have given me more than I can ever repay. You've reminded me of what matters, of who I want to be." Evelyn smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then I guess we're even." David chuckled, the sound carrying a lightness that felt unfamiliar but welcome. He looked around, at the house that now stood strong and proud, at Lucas playing with a group of neighborhood kids, at Evelyn standing beside him with gratitude etched into her face. In that moment, David felt something he hadn't in years, a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just a renovation of a house. It was a renovation of himself, of the way he saw the world and his place in it. The house had been reborn, and so it seemed had he. The renovation didn't just breathe new life into the house, it transformed the people within it. Each passing day deepened the bonds between David, Lucas, and Evelyn, weaving them into a tapestry of connection and trust. It was a journey of small moments, shared laughter, and quiet understanding. And while the physical structure of the house was being rebuilt, something intangible and profoundly human was being mended too. On a crisp morning, David arrived to find Lucas sitting cross-legged on the porch steps, sketching something on a sheet of paper. The boy looked up with his characteristic grin as David approached. "Morning, mister," Lucas exclaimed, holding up his drawing. "Look, I designed a treehouse. Think it could work?" David took the paper, studying the uneven lines and imaginative details. The treehouse was an ambitious project, with rope swings and secret compartments, a boy's dream come to life. "I think it's a great idea," David said, his tone serious. "But we'll need to make sure it's sturdy enough to handle all the adventures you're planning." Lucas's eyes lit up. "You mean we can build it?" David crouched beside him, his smile softening. "Why not? A house isn't just about walls and roofs. It's about creating a place where you can dream." Lucas beamed, and David felt a warmth rise in his chest, an echo of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about building a treehouse. It was about building a connection, one nail and plank at a time. Inside the house, Evelyn was busy unpacking boxes of new kitchenware David had quietly arranged to replace her aging pots and pans. She turned as he stepped through the door, her expression a mix of surprise and exasperation. "Mr. David," she began, "you've already done more than enough." David raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "Evelyn, it's not about enough. It's about making sure you and Lucas have everything you need to live comfortably." Evelyn sighed, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "You're impossible, you know that?" "I've been called worse," David replied, chuckling. "But seriously, this is what I want to do. For you, for Lucas." She hesitated, then nodded, her gratitude shining through her words. "Well, thank you for everything." The afternoons were filled with the hum of saws and the rhythmic pounding of hammers as the treehouse began to take shape. Lucas was David's constant shadow, peppering him with questions and eagerly lending a hand. Though his small stature limited what he could do, his enthusiasm was boundless, and David found himself inspired by the boy's infectious energy. "You know, Lucas," David said one day as they fastened planks together, "when I was your age, I dreamed about building things too. I wanted to be an architect." "What happened?" Lucas asked, his brow furrowed with curiosity. David paused, the question catching him off guard. "Life happened," he said finally. Responsibilities, career. Somewhere along the way, I forgot about those dreams." Lucas tilted his head, considering this. Maybe you didn't forget. Maybe you just needed a reminder." David stared at the boy, struck by the simplicity and wisdom of his words. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. Evelyn often joined them outside, bringing glasses of lemonade or offering snacks to the workers. In those moments, the house felt alive, not just with the bustle of construction, but with laughter and warmth. David noticed how Lucas would light up around his mother, their bond evident in the way they teased and supported each other. It reminded him of a time when his own family had been close, before success had distanced him from the people who mattered most. One evening, after the workers had left and the yard was quiet, Evelyn and David sat on the porch while Lucas played in the newly finished treehouse. The sky was awash with hues of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that demanded silence and reflection. "You've changed, you know," Evelyn said, breaking the comfortable quiet. And David turned to her, surprised. "Have I?" She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "When we first met, you were polite but distant, like you were wearing armor. Now, it's like you've let yourself be human again." David smiled, though her words struck a deep chord within him. "I think I've spent so much of my life chasing things, money, success, status, that I forgot how to just be." Evelyn looked at him, her expression soft. "Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad it did. You've done more than fix this house, David. You've reminded us that we're not alone." Her words lingered in the air, sinking into David's heart. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, when this project had become about more than a house, but it had, and he felt it in every nail he hammered, every beam he lifted, and every moment he spent with Lucas and Evelyn. The final touches on the renovation were completed on a warm Saturday afternoon. The house stood proud and strong, a beacon of resilience and hope. The neighbors gathered to celebrate, their laughter mingling with the sound of music and the smell of grilled food. Lucas darted through the crowd, showing off the treehouse to anyone who would follow him, his joy as radiant as the sun overhead. David stood to the side, watching the scene unfold. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Not the stress he was used to, but something softer, fuller. It was gratitude, he realized. Gratitude for this unexpected detour in his life, for the boy who had changed his tire, and for the chance to rediscover what truly mattered. Evelyn approached him, a plate of food in her hands. "You look like a man who's found something he didn't know he was looking for," she said, her voice warm with understanding. David chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I have. And it's not just this house, Evelyn. It's everything. You, Lucas, you've given me a perspective I didn't know I needed." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you've given us a future. That's no small thing, David." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the celebration wound down, Lucas found David sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. The boy plopped down beside him, his energy finally waning. "You okay, mister?" Lucas asked, his voice soft. David nodded, ruffling the boy's hair. "I'm better than okay, Lucas, thanks to you." Lucas frowned, confused. "I didn't do anything." David smiled, his eyes reflecting the glow of the string lights overhead. "You did everything. You reminded me what it means to be a good person, to care, to connect." Lucas grinned, leaning against David's shoulder. "Well, I'm glad I could help." David wrapped an arm around the boy, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because of what he'd built, but because of who he'd become. And as the stars emerged one by one in the night sky, David knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the windows of the newly renovated house, dancing across the fresh paint and polished wood. The air inside was different now. Not just cleaner, but lighter, as though the house itself had exhaled a sigh of relief. David stood in the living room, gazing around with quiet satisfaction. Yet the culmination of weeks of work and connection didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. Lucas bounded into the room, his face lit with the exuberance that only a child could muster. "Mister, you've got to see this," he exclaimed, tugging at David's sleeve. David followed him out onto the porch, where the boy pointed to the treehouse, now complete. In the soft glow of morning, it stood as a symbol of resilience and imagination, its sturdy frame blending seamlessly with the tree's sprawling branches. "I think it's perfect," Lucas declared, his chest puffed out with pride. "Don't you?" David smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's more than perfect, Lucas. It's yours." The boy beamed, his joy infectious. For a moment, David allowed himself to bask in the warmth of Lucas's excitement, the pure, unfiltered wonder that came so easily to him. But the thought that had been simmering in David's mind for days refused to be ignored. He had one last thing to do. Later that afternoon, when the house was quiet, David pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket and held it tightly, as though it carried not just paper, but the weight of something greater. His palms felt clammy, and for the first time in years, he hesitated. This wasn't a business deal or a carefully calculated investment. It was something far more personal. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, humming softly as she wiped the counters. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, her expression softened. "David," she said, setting the cloth down, "you've been staring at me like that all week. What's on your mind?" David chuckled nervously, stepping forward. I've been thinking about Lucas, about the future." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, curious but patient. "What about it?" David handed her the envelope, his hand steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. "This is for him, for you, for whatever comes next." She frowned, taking the envelope cautiously. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a trust fund document, neatly typed and stamped with an official seal, outlining a substantial sum set aside for Lucas's education and future endeavors. Her hands trembled as she read the numbers. "David, this is too much," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not enough," David countered, his tone firm but gentle. "Nothing I do will ever be enough to repay what you and Lucas have given me. This isn't charity, Evelyn. It's hope. It's a chance for Lucas to dream as big as he wants and know he can make those dreams come true." Evelyn looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below after watching the story. What part of the video did you enjoy the most?" "You don't have to say anything," David replied. "Just promise me one thing. Let him decide. Let him know the world is his to shape, that he's not limited by anything except the size of his imagination." That evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, David called Lucas over. The boy came running, his curiosity evident in the way his head tilted slightly, as though trying to read David's thoughts. "What's up, mister?" Lucas asked, plopping down on the step beside him. David handed him the envelope, the same one he'd given Evelyn. "This is for you, Lucas. For your future." Lucas opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the document with growing confusion. "What is this?" "It's a trust fund," David explained. "For college or anything else you decide to do when you're older. It's yours to use when the time comes." The boy's face transformed as realization dawned. His wide eyes met David's, a mixture of disbelief and awe. "You mean I can really go to college?" "You can do whatever you want," David said, his voice steady. "This is your chance to dream big, Lucas, to build the life you want." Lucas stared at the paper for a long moment before setting it down and throwing his arms around David in a hug that was equal parts gratitude and joy. "Thank you, mister," he said, his voice muffled against David's shoulder. "You've changed everything." David felt his throat tighten, and he blinked rapidly to keep his own emotions at bay. "Oh, no, Lucas, you've changed me." The days that followed were filled with an air of celebration. Neighbors stopped by to marvel at the house and offer their congratulations, and Lucas proudly gave tours of the treehouse he now called his sanctuary. David, for his part, found himself more at ease than he had been in years. The weight he hadn't realized he was carrying seemed to lift with every smile and laugh shared between him, Lucas, and Evelyn. On the final evening, before David planned to leave, Evelyn asked him to join her on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air was filled with the hum of crickets. She handed him a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "You've done so much for us," she said quietly. "But I have to ask, why?" David stared into the steaming cup, searching for the right words. "Because it felt right," he said finally. "For so long I've measured my success by what I could take, by what I could build for myself. But this has shown me that the real measure of success is what you can give. You and Lucas taught me that." Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but kind. "You've given us more than a house or a trust fund, David. You've given us a future, and I hope you know that you're a part of it." The words settled over him like a warm blanket, soothing and comforting. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As the night deepened and the stars appeared one by one, David found himself sitting beneath the treehouse, gazing up at the twinkling lights Lucas had strung along its edges. The boy's laughter echoed from above, mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. David closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt complete. Not because of his wealth or accomplishments, but because of the connections he had forged, the lives he had touched, and the profound realization that sometimes The smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. This wasn't just a gift for Lucas, it was a gift for himself. A reminder that humanity wasn't defined by what one owned, but by what one gave. And in giving, David had found something priceless, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of himself. The days that followed felt like a dream in slow motion for David. The house was no longer a crumbling structure on a quiet road, but a vibrant home filled with warmth and possibility. The transformation wasn't just evident in the freshly painted walls or the sturdy roof, it radiated from Lucas's laughter, Evelyn's newfound ease, and David's own sense of belonging. On a sunny afternoon, the front yard buzzed with life. Neighbors had gathered, children darting between the newly built treehouse and the porch as adults chatted in groups. Lucas was at the center of it all, his joy as infectious as ever. David stood by the porch railing, watching the scene unfold. His tailored suits felt like relics of a past life. Today he wore jeans and a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up. The man who once measured success by profit margins in quarterly reports now found satisfaction in the simplicity of a boy's smile. Evelyn approached him, carrying a tray of lemonade. "You seem lost in thought," she said, handing him a glass. David took it, his lips curling into a small smile, just soaking it all in. "It feels like this place has come alive." "It has," Evelyn said, her gaze following his. "And so have you." David turned to her, her words striking a chord. "Do you really think I've changed that much?" Evelyn chuckled, leaning against the railing. "When I first met you, you were polite but distant, like you were carrying the weight of the world and didn't trust anyone else to share it. Now, you're lighter, freer." David considered her words, the weight of their truth settling over him. "I think I've spent so long building walls, keeping people out, protecting myself, that I forgot what it feels like to let someone in." Evelyn smiled, her expression soft. "Well, I'd say you've done a pretty good job of letting us in." That evening, as the guests began to leave and the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas climbed onto the porch and flopped into a chair beside David. The boy's cheeks were flushed from running around, his energy only slightly dimmed by the fading light. "Mister," Lucas said, catching his breath, "do you ever think about what you'd do if you could start over?" David turned to him, startled by the question. "Start over?" "Yeah," Lucas said, swinging his legs. "Like, if you could go back and do something different, would you?" David leaned back, his gaze drifting to the darkening sky. "I don't know if I'd want to start over. I've made mistakes, plenty of them, but they've brought me here. And here, this feels right." Lucas grinned. "So, no regrets?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "Plenty of regrets, but I've learned from them, and maybe that's what matters." Lucas tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I think you're pretty cool, mister, even if you don't always believe it." David laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Well, thanks, kid. I'm working on it." The next morning, David woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. For the first time in years, he felt no rush to check his phone or tackle a to-do list. Instead, he lingered in the stillness, savoring the rare sense of peace that had settled over him. When he stepped outside, the yard was already bustling. Lucas was perched in the treehouse, waving down at him, while Evelyn tended to the small flower bed she had started beside the porch. David joined her, kneeling to help pull weeds. "Do you know anything about gardening?" Evelyn teased, glancing at him. "Not a thing," David admitted, grinning, "but I'm willing to learn." She laughed, handing him a small spade. "Well, let's start with this. Dig around the roots, but be gentle. Plants are stronger than they look, but they still need care." David worked beside her, the earth cool and firm beneath his hands. The act of gardening, simple, grounding, felt oddly therapeutic. As they worked, Evelyn shared stories about her life before the house began to fall apart, about Lucas's mischievous childhood antics, and about the dreams she once had for herself. "You should still dream, Evelyn," David said softly, his gaze steady. "It's never too late." She looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Maybe I will." That afternoon, David called Lucas down from the treehouse and handed him a small notebook. The boy looked up at him, puzzled. "What's this?" Lucas asked, flipping through the blank pages. It's for your ideas," David said. "It's for every dream, every plan, every crazy invention you can think of. Write them down, and one day, you'll make them real." Lucas's eyes widened, his excitement barely contained. "Really? You think I could?" David crouched to meet his gaze, his voice firm. "I know you can. You've got everything it takes, Lucas. Don't ever doubt that." The boy hugged the notebook to his chest, his grin wide and full of hope. "Thanks, mister. I'll fill this up in no time." As the days turned into weeks, David began to realize just how much he had changed. The man who once lived for deadlines and deals now found joy in moments of connection, in the way Lucas's eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams, in the quiet strength of Evelyn's resilience, and in the way the house seemed to hum with life and possibility. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Evelyn raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice warm, "and to the people who make them possible." David hesitated, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He raised his glass, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "To family, because that's what this feels like." Lucas beamed, clinking his glass against David's. "You're stuck with us now, mister?" David laughed, a sound that came from deep within, unrestrained and genuine. "I wouldn't have it any other way." In the quiet hours after dinner, David found himself sitting on the porch, gazing up at the stars. The sky stretched out endlessly above him, a reminder of how small his world had been before this journey. He thought of the house, of Lucas and Evelyn, of the way they had opened their lives to him without hesitation or expectation. He realized then that the transformation he had witnessed wasn't just about the house or the family. It was about himself. The man who had once seen the world as a series of transactions now understood the power of connection, of giving without asking, of letting go of the walls he had built. David closed his eyes, a sense of contentment settling over him. He wasn't the same man who had driven down that rural road weeks ago, cursing a flat tire. He was someone new, someone better. As he stood to head inside, he heard Lucas's voice from the treehouse. "Good night, mister. Don't forget, tomorrow we're building that zip line." David chuckled, shaking his head. "Good night, Lucas, and don't worry, I'll be ready." As he climbed the steps to the porch, David felt a profound sense of gratitude for Lucas, for Evelyn, for the unexpected turn his life had taken. The house was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of something far greater. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change not just one life, but many, and in that change, there was hope. Not just for those he had helped, but for himself as well. The morning air carried a crispness that felt like a whisper of new beginnings. David stood on the porch, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the steam curling into the air like fleeting memories. The house behind him, once crumbling and forgotten, now stood as a proud testament to resilience and connection. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, filled with laughter, hope, and the quiet strength of those who lived within its walls. Lucas's voice rang out from the yard, pulling David from his thoughts. "Mister, watch this." David turned to see Lucas perched on the edge of the treehouse, holding onto the rope of the zip line they'd built the day before. Without hesitation, the boy launched himself forward, gliding down with a whoop of pure joy. He landed in a pile of leaves, beaming up at David. "How was that?" Lucas called, his grin as bright as the morning sun. David laughed, shaking his head. "Perfect. You're a natural." Lucas sprinted toward him, his energy boundless. "Thanks for building it, mister. It's the best thing ever." David crouched to meet the boy's gaze, his voice soft but firm. "You know, Lucas, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Lucas's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something deeper, an understanding that belied his age. He nodded, then threw his arms around David in a hug that was as much for himself as it was for the man who had become an anchor in his life. Inside, Evelyn was busy setting the table for breakfast. The kitchen, once a place of wear and tear, now radiated warmth, the morning light dancing off the fresh tiles and polished counters. David stepped in, the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. "Lucas already using the zip line?" Evelyn asked, her tone teasing. David chuckled, setting his mug down. "He's unstoppable." Evelyn smiled, her movements deliberate as she placed the last plate on the table. "So are you, it seems." David leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." "What way?" Evelyn asked, turning to face him. And as the fire crackled softly, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Together, they would rebuild what had been broken, one moment at a time. Together, they would create something stronger, something whole. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah's home, casting golden streaks on the walls. A quiet calm settled over the house as Eden and Mike played in the backyard, their laughter floating in through the open kitchen window. Sarah stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on the boys. Their bond had deepened over the past few months, transforming from a novelty into something natural, unbreakable. They were no longer strangers navigating their similarities. They were brothers, in every sense of the word. Clara's car pulled into the driveway, and Sarah stepped outside to greet her. Clara exited with a warm smile, holding a dish covered in foil. "Oh, morning," Clara said, handing the dish to Sarah. "Thought I'd bring over my famous lasagnas since the boys seem to eat us out of house and home every weekend." Sarah laughed, lifting the foil to peek at the layers of pasta and sauce. "You're a lifesaver. They're already asking what's for lunch." Clara's gaze drifted to the boys, her smile softening. "They've really settled into this, haven't they? Like they've always been together." Sarah nodded. "It's amazing to watch. But more than that, it's healing. For all of us." Clara turned to Sarah, her expression growing more serious. "And you? How are you doing with everything? With George?" Sarah exhaled deeply, leaning against the doorframe. "It's been complicated. I won't lie. There are still moments where I feel the weight of what he did. But he's trying, Clara. Really trying. And I see it, not just in how he treats me, but in how he's stepped up for Eden, for Mike even." Clara reached out, squeezing Sarah's arm. "You're stronger than you think. And whatever happens, the boys will always have us." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Clara had become more than a fellow mother in this strange journey. They were partners, allies in navigating a path neither had expected but both were committed to. As summer approached, the families decided to plan a joint vacation, a chance to create new memories and continue building the bridge between their lives. After much deliberation and endless lobbying from the boys, they settled on a beach trip. The idea of sun-soaked days and nights filled with laughter appealed to everyone, offering a much-needed escape from the emotional roller coaster of the past months. The beach house they rented was nestled along a quiet stretch of coastline, its wraparound porch overlooking the endless expanse of ocean. The first evening was spent unpacking, settling into rooms and preparing a casual dinner of grilled fish and fresh salads. The boys raced along the shoreline, their footprints crisscrossing in the wet sand as they chased each other with wild abandon. George, standing on the porch with a drink in hand, watched them with a wistful smile. Sarah joined him, a soft breeze tugging at her hair. "They're happy?" George said, his voice low. "They are," Sarah agreed, leaning on the railing beside him. "And they deserve to be." George turned to her, his expression earnest. "Sarah, I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For all of it. For the lies, for the pain I caused. I know I can't undo it, but I'm trying to be better. For you, for Eden." Sarah looked at him, her emotions a swirl of lingering hurt and cautious hope. "You've come a long way, George. But trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. It takes time." "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by the boys calling them down to the beach, their voices filled with excitement over the sandcastle they were building. Sarah glanced at George and, for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of the partnership they once had. Perhaps, she thought, healing wasn't so far out of reach after all. The beach trip proved to be transformative. Mornings were spent collecting seashells and exploring tide pools, afternoons filled with swimming and sandcastles, and evenings reserved for bonfires under the stars. The boys thrived in the freedom of the outdoors, their bond growing even stronger with each shared adventure. One night, as the families gathered around the fire, Eden and Mike hatched a plan to host a talent show for the adults. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and soon everyone was roped into participating. George reluctantly agreed to play his old guitar, while Clara performed a comedic monologue that had everyone in stitches. Sarah surprised them all with a soulful rendition of an old folk song, her voice carrying a bittersweet beauty that left the group momentarily silent. When it was Eden and Mike's turn, they stood proudly before their audience, announcing they had prepared a skit. The performance was chaotic and hilarious, filled with exaggerated voices and playful jabs at their parents. By the end, everyone was doubled over with laughter, tears streaming down their cheeks. As the fire died down, Sarah looked around at the people who had become her family. George, Clara, the boys. The darkness of the past months hadn't disappeared, but in its place there was light, there was laughter, there was love. Returning home after the trip, life resumed with a newfound sense of normalcy. Eden and Mike split their time between houses, their lives becoming a seamless blend of two families. Clara and Sarah grew closer, often meeting for coffee or walking the boys to school together. Even George, once a distant figure in Clara's life, found ways to connect with her, his efforts to make amends extending beyond Sarah and Eden. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as Sarah was helping Eden with his homework, he hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. "Mom," he said softly, "do you ever think Mike missed me?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She set down the papers she was sorting and knelt beside him. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Eden said, fidgeting with the edge of his notebook, "if we're twins, does that mean he knew I was missing, like, in his heart?" Tears pricked Sarah's eyes at the innocence of his question. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes people can feel a connection even when they don't know where it comes from. And now that you've found each other, that connection can only grow stronger." Eden nodded, seeming comforted by her words, but as he returned to his homework, Sarah couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Had Mike felt the absence of his brother all those years? Had Eden? And what would their futures hold now that they were finally reunited? Months turned into a year, and the family settled into a rhythm that felt almost effortless. Birthdays were celebrated with joint parties, and holidays became shared affairs filled with laughter and togetherness. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer loomed over them like a shadow. Instead, it became a testament to their resilience, a reminder of how far they had come. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, the families gathered at the park for a picnic. The boys raced ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees. George and Clara sat up the blanket while Sarah unpacked the food. As they sat together, passing sandwiches and swapping stories, Clara turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd find myself in this kind of situation. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad we all found each other." If you find it interesting, please comment with the number 2. If it's not engaging, press 1 so we can improve the content and make it even better. Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Me too. It's not the life I expected, but maybe it's the one we were meant to have." George, overhearing their exchange, nodded. "Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the best places." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the families packed up and headed home. Sarah lingered for a moment, watching Eden and Mike walk ahead, their identical silhouettes framed by the fading light. In their bond, she saw a promise, a future filled with love, connection, and the strength of a family that had weathered the storm together. Life, Sarah realized, wasn't perfect. It was messy and unpredictable, filled with mistakes and pain. But it was also beautiful, rich with moments of joy and the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. And as she walked toward her family, she felt a quiet certainty. They would be okay. Together, they would always find their way.